I am launching SinisterShaf merchandise exclusively available during Shaftober 2017. So, if you are interested in purchasing a cup or a t-shirt, then please send me an email to SinisterShaf@gmail.com. The email address can also be found in the description box below. If you would like a piece of this merchandise, then please hurry, because it is only available for a limited time. The price for regular cups will be £8. For the colour changing cups, it will be £10. And t-shirts in black or white will be £12. These prices do not include postage, because postage may vary depending on where you live. So, I've got a bunch of family coming in for Halloween. In our tradition, we usually have a small party of close family and friends, hang out and watch old scary movies over a potluck of amazing food. Not everyone has arrived yet, of course, but we had dinner with everyone who already made it here last night. We got on the topic of scary stories, and my family members had a surprising number of them. I would like to preface this by saying I am an atheist and a scientist, not prone to belief in paranormal nonsense. However, I have had some experiences, which I cannot explain, that have led me to have an open mind towards others, even if I know science doesn't support their claims. Every scientist must accept that there are some things we do not yet understand. On top of that, many of my family members are very old-fashioned. In their traditions, certain things just weren't spoken about. Strange sights, abilities, happenings. It just wasn't done to discuss them freely. But this was 2016, and I'd managed to wheedle out some of the most interesting, creepy stories I'd ever heard. Some of my family, I'm sure, exaggerated for dramatic effect, but there are many who I know are 100% trustworthy and not creative enough to come up with tales like these. There's also physical proof that I've seen in some cases. I will only be retelling what I feel are the creepiest and most genuine accounts. That being said, the first story was told by my mother. This particular story is absolutely true. Not only has her account of events never changed. My mother is as serious and secular as I am. I'm positive this is not the type of thing she'd lie about. My mother Leanne was something of the black sheep in her family, being the eldest of 5 siblings, and my grandmother, being a single mother, meant that my mum had a lot of responsibility thrust onto her at a very young age. She went through a rebellious stage, moving across the country with her fiancé against the family's wishes. This took place in 1991, 1 year before I was born. My mother moved to Tennessee with her fiancé, Keith. Keith was a painter and worked in construction, and my mother struggled to find a job in a completely new place, cut off from her family and friends. They didn't have very much money, so when looking for a place to live, they had to settle for what they could get. The house was in an average neighborhood and wasn't very impressive. It was 2 stories with 2 bedrooms upstairs, but the place had been mid-renovation. Keith had agreed to fix up the house in exchange for lower rent. My mother told me that the very first time she noticed something strange was the very first time they pulled up in the driveway. Keith was showing her the house to make sure she liked it before finalizing the paperwork. When he parked the car, my mother saw a girl in the window upstairs, staring at them through a gap in the curtains. The girl had brown hair and was wearing white, but my mother couldn't see more than that. She turned and asked, "Are there owners here to show us around?" Keith had laughed.
"Show us around what? It's a small house."
When she tried to point out the girl to Keith, there was nothing there at all. Keith, of course, thought she was only trying to scare him. My mother, being a realist and non-superstitious, believed it must have been a trick of the light. They eventually agreed to rent the place and moved in. This is where the real creepiness begins. There were a few small things they noticed at first. Sometimes, early in the morning, the kitchen would smell strongly of bacon and coffee, as though someone had just finished cooking. Sometimes, a door would swing shut, but they believed this to be because the house was rather old and drafty. The smaller of the two bedrooms upstairs, my mother referred to as the cold room, because it was always freezing, even though it was frequently unused and had the windows closed and locked. This is the room that my mother thought she had seen a girl standing in when they first arrived. There was a small door to a crawl space with an old-fashioned crystal knob that had been painted over and would not open. Finally, there was a section of the wall upstairs that was missing as part of the renovations. It instead had a thick piece of plywood cut to fit the gap and sealed up tight. The plywood, set into the gap in the wall, continually fell out. Keith duct taped the edges, and it still fell out. They pressed heavy boxes up against it, and it still fell out. You could hear it drop heavily from downstairs, and my mother said this quickly moved from annoying to disturbing. Beyond the plywood was a gap in the space between the walls, with nothing but wiring, but big enough to be a small closet. My mum said it was too dark to see much, and they just fixed the plywood back into place each time it fell. Within weeks of moving there, the two of them began fixing up the place. One day, my mother was cleaning the downstairs bathroom, on her knees scrubbing the tub, while Keith was outside working. As she was cleaning, she felt someone pinch her. Living with her fiancé, she laughed and turned, hoping to catch him, only to find no one there. Believing that Keith must have been hiding in the hallway, she started talking to him. "Oh, I wonder who that could have been," she said sarcastically. "You do know I'm busy in here, like you should be too." She returned to cleaning. Again she felt a pinch on her backside, and she quickly turned only to find no one there. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she asked. "Well, I'll catch you next time." This time, she kept cleaning, but bent over far enough that she could see down between her legs. She planned to see him creep around the corner and quickly grab his ankle before he could escape. But when she next felt the sharp pinch, There was no one there. My mother was horrified by this and quickly got up and ran outside. Keith was on a ladder, fixing something. When he saw her, he laughed.
"Weren't so sneaky this time, were you? You know it's dangerous to tease a man while he's working. I could fall and break my back,"
he said to her. Still scared, she quickly explained what had happened to her, and Keith replied that he'd felt something similar. He kept thinking she was reaching out of the doorway to pinch him. But when they realised that neither of them had been teasing the other, my mum was very unsettled. But Keith was a country boy, with little care for it all.
"What? You think it's a ghost or something? Come on, Leanne. It's no big deal,"
he'd say. My mother finally conceded to ignore it, but she said she was suddenly aware of the house in a way she hadn't been before. She started to record the events that were happening. As time passed, more strange events piled up. In the cold room, there was a dartboard on the wall. Both Keith and my mother noticed that no matter where you'd left the darts in the room, upon returning, they would all be in the bullseye. They each thought it was the other one cleaning up, but quickly discovered it wasn't. Keith insisted on ignoring it, but my mother's inquisitive nature wouldn't allow that. While Keith was at work, she looked up things in magazines and books. She said that she read about leaving a notebook and pencil out, which might allow ghosts to communicate. So, she left a blank notebook and pencil in the cold room. Another feature of the cold room was a walk-in closet. She said that she was trying to find storage for some boxes when she first opened it. There were a lot of old winter clothes hanging, and no light inside, making it very dark. My mother reached into the closet, both arms outstretched, looking for the back wall, so that she could figure out how many boxes she could fit in. She said she took 3 or 4 steps in, arms fully outstretched. The closet, icy cold, and the light of the room behind her getting dimmer the further she went in. She never felt a back wall. My mother suddenly got a bad feeling and quickly left the closet. She closed the door and never tried to enter again. One last event that occurred in the cold room was when my mother was cleaning. She said it was mid-morning and she was just tidying and checking the notebook. It was blank, and it had been long enough without a strange occurrence that she believed maybe it wasn't real after all. When she tried to leave the room, the door refused to open. My mother was locked inside. She banged on the door, jiggled the doorknob, shoved her shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge in the slightest. Remember, this is 1991. No cell phones, and there was no landline in that room. She was annoyed at the old house, but she said she wasn't scared. She sat by the window and waited, hoping Keith would come by on his lunch break. He didn't. She waited all day long, until nearly 5 p.m, when Keith finally returned. When she heard the front door, my mum began banging and yelling, "I'm in here! I'm in here!" to get his attention. Keith immediately came upstairs and asked what she was doing. "I'm locked inside," she shouted. "The door's locked and I can't get out." Keith, annoyed with the drama after a long day at work, reminded her.
Leanne, there's no lock on the door.
My mother, equally annoyed with having been trapped all day, grabbed the doorknob to shake it, saying, "It's jammed!" But as soon as she twisted the knob, the door opened as easy as anything. They apparently argued that night, my mother angry that Keith refused to believe her, instead blaming the event on a
Cali girl not knowing how to shove open a door that's stuck.
The events up to this point had been creepy little irritations, but nothing truly terrifying. That changed after their 3rd month living there. Keith invited over his brother Daryl and his wife Amy, as well as Amy's friend Jennifer. The 5 of them were all drinking and having a good time. At one point, the 3 women were all in the kitchen discussing music, while my mother was cutting up garlic bread. Daryl and Keith had been in the living room together, when suddenly, Daryl entered the kitchen. My mother remembers that Amy made a comment about Cher being one of the greatest artists ever, or something like that, when out of nowhere, Daryl became livid and he started throwing slurs.
Why are you talking about that woman? You want to be just like her?
The women were struck silent, confused at the man's temper over such an innocuous statement. According to my mum, Amy even laughed at first. "What the hell? Keep that up and you're on the couch tonight," she replied. Daryl was not joking.
You think I don't know what you do behind my back?
He yelled at her, and all the women became aware this was deadly serious.
You're a witch,
Daryl shouted at her. Distraught, Amy at first tried to reason with him. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "What's wrong with you?" Daryl grabbed the knife from the cutting board that my mother had been using, and Amy screamed. He threatened her, and my mother says she doesn't remember everything he was saying at this point, but none of it made sense. While Daryl had Amy cornered in the kitchen, ranting about babies and making her pay, my mother ran to the living room to get Keith for help. He was asleep. Usually, Keith is an extremely light sleeper. My mother recounted, since moving into the house, he'd been plagued by nightmares, and he woke at the slightest noise. Sure, he had been drinking, but not enough for him to pass out. This night, he would not wake. My mother said Daryl was yelling, and Amy was crying, and Jennifer was shouting about calling the police. My mother was screaming into Keith's face and shaking him, even pulled him off the couch, but he just flopped to the ground, still completely asleep. My mother wasn't in the kitchen to see what happened next, but Jennifer apparently got Daryl's attention long enough for Amy to slip out of the corner and run. Daryl swung the knife after her and cut her arm. The women were crying and running. My mother ran with them into the downstairs bathroom and locked the door. Daryl was screaming at them and banging on the door.
"I'll cut the devil right out of you,"
he shrieked, banging on the door so hard that it shook on its hinges. My mother was a thicker girl, and the window out of the bathroom was very narrow. Jennifer was thin enough to fit through, so while my mother pressed her back to the door to keep it closed, Amy helped Jennifer crawl outside. Jennifer managed to get a neighbour and call the police. It took them about 10 minutes to arrive. during which my mother said she was terrified and sobbing. My mother said that Amy tried to speak reason to Daryl, asking why he was doing this, what she did wrong, asking him to please just stop, even apologizing. Daryl was beyond rationality. My mother said what made it so scary was that nothing he was saying even made sense. It seemed disjointed. Threats about hellfire and accusations of cheating that were not in Daryl's character at all. He certainly wasn't the perfect husband. There had been some domestic disputes in the past, but nothing on the level of death threats. When the police arrived, they disarmed and arrested Daryl. There is an actual record of this, and my mother gave a statement about the event. She also said that as soon as Daryl stepped outside, within seconds, Keith woke up. He was groggy and asked what the hell happened. He was also questioned by the police, but had witnessed nothing. They assumed because of the alcohol that he'd passed out, but my mother knew better. My mother told me that after a few hours of holding, Daryl calmed down. The couple and their friend refused to ever return to that house. My mother said she asked Keith about his brother a few times, but he didn't want to talk about it. She says she doesn't think Amy pressed charges, and she's not sure if Daryl went to jail over the whole thing. She did say she once tried to call Amy, only to have the other woman hang up on her. In their fourth and final month of staying at this house, Keith was working incessantly on trying to get the crawl space door open. It was almost like a pet project of his. One Saturday, he woke early and began working on prying it open. He worked well into the afternoon, at which point my mother went to stop him. She told him to give up on the thing, that he was going to injure himself and he needed to take a break. Keith agreed to take a break at least and stood with her to go downstairs for lunch. My mother said that as soon as they were halfway down the stairs, they heard a loud creak. They each froze before slowly turning around to find the crawl space door had swung open. Having dealt with nightmares and all these strange unexplainable events, my mother was instantly on guard. Keith, too, was far more wary of the house and had no longer been trying to convince my mum it wasn't real. But he hadn't quite begun to believe her either. My mum said that in his generation, it just wasn't done to speak aloud about those types of concerns.
I guess I finally loosened it,
Keith said, and my mother did a double take. Are you kidding me? She asked. That thing opened while we're all the way over here. Just close it.
I've been trying to get into this thing for months, Leanne,
Keith argued.
I'm gonna see what's in it. We need the space.
No, we don't, my mother retorted, but she was ignored. Keith approached the door, crouching down to go inside, and my mother, though scared, couldn't abandon her fiancé. She walked over and stood by his side. As Keith slowly tried to crawl inside, my mother grabbed his shoulder and stopped him. What the hell do you think you're doing? She asked.
Well, how am I gonna reach inside?
Keith replied. Shining a flashlight from his toolbox, Keith described seeing a bunch of boxes and old stuff. He said he couldn't see the back wall, and wondered aloud how big the space actually was. He wanted to crawl in further, but my mother protested so loudly that he finally gave up on the notion and shut the door. This door was right at the top of the stairs, and now that it had been opened once, my mother said that it was frequently open. They would close it each time, but then when they tried to go upstairs, they would see the door open and the darkness of the crawl space beyond. One day, after the plywood fell from the wall upstairs again, my mum decided to move the notebook in there. She still wasn't sure if she believed in ghosts, but she wanted some kind of proof. She pinned the notebook inside along with a pen on a string. She also decided to leave a quarter in a chalk circle, another tip from a book. A few days later, my mother said she was preparing dinner, and Keith came into the kitchen to help. They'd been chatting and making jokes until Keith started chopping vegetables. My mother made a comment, something about a lady on the news, when suddenly Keith began throwing profanities.
Why are you talking about her? You want to be like her?
My mum said she got chills immediately, and when she looked over, realised that Keith was using the exact same knife that Daryl had threatened Amy with. Remember, Keith was asleep during that fight and had never heard his brother say those words. She told him she'd forgotten something from the store, grabbed the keys, and ran. She didn't return until the next morning, choosing to stay over at a friend's house. She said nothing happened that night, but hearing those words had frightened her to the core. When she asked Keith about it later, he claimed he didn't remember saying it and was only upset that she'd left in such a hurry. They planned to move, unable to stand the nightmares and uncanny happenings at the house any longer. However, they had to wait until the end of the month. When they had only 1 week left, they were sitting together watching a movie late into the night, when they heard the plywood upstairs fall out of the wall. Keith went to replace it, and my mother went with him, unwilling to sit alone downstairs and wait. Knowing that they'd soon be moving out, Keith actually peeked his head inside the wall, commenting,
I wonder how far this actually goes back.
My mother insisted that he not go in, claiming it gave her a sick feeling to even look at the darkness inside the wall. She said it was unnaturally dark. They shone a flashlight in and couldn't see an end to the room. No other end of the wall. In fact, the floor didn't continue all the way inside, but they couldn't see down to the bottom downstairs. It looked like unending darkness. This was the first time either of them had really explored the area. My mother saw that the notebook she tacked up as well as the pen were lying on the floor, the paper torn, and the quarter was moved from its chalk circle. She began to freak out, demanding they leave right then. That was plenty enough proof for her, and she didn't want to sleep in that house one more night. Keith didn't understand her fear, scolding her for buying into the paranormal rubbish and using a notebook and pen to communicate. My mother argued that the wall was unnatural. With the layout of the house, the wall should have led only straight to the outside. There simply shouldn't have been enough space to create that kind of darkness. Keith insisted it was fine. To prove it, he picked up the quarter, throwing it to hear it hit the bottom. The quarter disappeared into the darkness. It was freezing cold, a draft coming from some place they couldn't see. My mum and Keith stood there for over a minute before he finally realised they weren't going to hear it hit anything. At that point, even if they did, it would have been too far to be anything other than supernatural. They were both so unsettled that they replaced the plywood and left immediately. They stayed in a hotel for the remainder of the week, returning to pack up their things during daylight. When they'd return, the plywood would be displaced again. When turning in their keys, the owner of the property said that Keith and my mum stayed there longer than anyone else who had rented the house in recent memory. Not only that, but that the people who'd left before them had had some kind of domestic dispute involving a knife and accusations of adultery. My mother researched the property and found that it had been on Native American land. Though that wasn't uncommon for the area, she couldn't find any record of crime that occurred there. Though she believes the events with the knives were too unlikely to be mere coincidences, she later divorced Keith and moved back to California. I'd like to remind you that this story is absolutely real. It may not have any jump scares or gore, but it is a description of a real haunting. More stories from family members coming soon. The next one is from my grandmother. Hello everyone, SinisterShaf here. This was the first installment to My Family's Scary Stories by VampieOreo. I would like to say thank you to VampieOreo for giving me permission to narrate your stories. There are 2 more parts to this series, which I will be uploading soon. I hope you enjoyed the second day of Shaftober. If you did, then make sure to like the video and subscribe if you have not done so already. Also, remember to click on the bell icon to be notified when I next upload. As you would have seen at the beginning of this video, if you would like to purchase some limited edition Shaftober 2017 merchandise, then email me. My email can be found in the description box below. Also, follow me on Twitter and like my Facebook page. The links to those are also in the description box. Also, if you have any of your own stories that you would like to share with me, then email them to me, message them to me on Facebook, or DM them to me via Twitter. My email is SinisterShaf@gmail.com. If you do send me your own stories, then you will be in with a chance to be included in my Shaftober special. The video for Shaftober Day 3 will be up very soon. And, as always, stay sinister.